That's how I got it. Yes. I'm on the road every other week. Oh, okay. So what are you doing? Anytime you're ready, you start.
Recording in progress.
Test.
Am I going to sound like that?
I just do that to test the sound.
That was deserved.
TV.
I know. I need to do that at home because they never hear me the first time I say it. Well, the only person that hears me. I got a couple people coming in the door.
Yeah. And it goes. Yeah. I know the Southwest corner. I know. They're doing it right.
I'm just trying to wait for.
Whenever you're ready.
All right, good evening, folks. As the last couple are walking in the door, we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Andy McDowell. I am with Western Reserve Land Conservancy. We are the largest land trust in Ohio. I'll tell you a little bit about our background in a minute. But what the presentation does not cover is a little bit about me, so you kind of know where I'm coming from with this and how I got to be with Western Reserve. And if you are a landowner and you get to work with me on maybe on something, then it's good to kind of have a little background to who I am and where I came from. I've been with Western Reserve Land Conservancy for just over 15 years. I started with them in 2006. Prior to that, I worked downtown Cleveland at the Great Lakes Science Center. I was the vice president of museum operations and exhibits there, where I ran most of the facilities down at the Great Lakes Science Center. And I was there for 10 years. And prior to that, I came from Pennsylvania, which is where I grew up. I grew up in Slippery Rock. I worked on farms. My father was an agricultural farm mechanic all of his life. I went to Slippery Rock University for environmental education. I also have a degree in parks and recreation management. I've gone into two-year colleges and taught forestry and wildlife management and a few other classes similar to those. And then I also spent a fair amount of time working for Pennsylvania State Parks before I moved to Ohio. So I worked at 4 different state parks in Pennsylvania prior to coming to Ohio. I also did a lot of emergency rescue work in my time in Pennsylvania, firefighting, EMS, specializing in outdoor rescue situations like water rescue and search and rescue and wilderness medicine. So that's kind of my background in a nutshell. I live in North Ridgeville. My wife doesn't work too far from here, kind of. She works over at Stan Hewitt. A couple young kids. We're in 4-H. My wife's a 4-H advisor. So I maintain a lot of old farm old tractors, hunt, fish, camp, canoe, all those kind of outdoorsy things. So that's kind of me in a nutshell. So with Western Reserve Land Conservancy, I got here something that you guys aren't seeing evidently, and I can't see it either. Oh, we're being recorded. So Western Reserve Land Conservancy is a private nonprofit corporation. We're a 501c3, so we are classified as a charitable organization. We work with private landowners as well as other nonprofits and government entities to help preserve land throughout Northeast Ohio. Some of that is private property, some of that is now public parks or nature preserves, some of it is even nature preserves that have very limited public access. So it's a wide range of things that we do. To date, we've preserved over 65,000 acres and just over 800 properties across Northeast Ohio. Ooh, I didn't even hardly touch it. So what our vision is to try to couple together all the assets that we have in Northeast Ohio. As we all know, we got a lot of urban areas in Ohio. We got a lot of small towns, mid-sized cities, a lot of farmland, a lot of nice natural areas. And as an organization, we try to look at that from a regional aspect in terms of how does the rural areas interact with the suburban areas and the urban areas. What are the critical natural resource assets that those separate communities want to help preserve, but then how does that all tie in together? So we work in a lot of different areas. We want to see Northeast Ohio as a productive as a whole. You know, if we just focused on farmland, well, that doesn't do anything for the natural areas. That doesn't help create public parks. That doesn't get kids into the outdoors more. That doesn't help our blighted industrial areas in the greater Cleveland area, Youngstown, Akron, and those areas. So we try not to really stay in one focused areas. We really have 3 focus areas that we spend most of our time on. But obviously the predecessor of all of this as an organization is natural areas and biodiversity. So we look at a lot of natural area lands that have a high ecological value and in some cases mediocre ecological value. You know, we live in a very human-built world. It's not like we're in, you know, the Upper Grand Tetons or something, or Rocky Mountain National Park, where you don't have a lot of human influence. Northeast Ohio has a lot of human influences. So if you have a very ecologically rich area, it's generally not going to be 500 acres in size. They're going to be smaller in size. But we do, all of our organizations that help create us, which I'll talk about in a minute, the primary focus was natural areas and biodiversity. So that's kind of where we came from as an organization. We've helped to create over 175 public parks and preserves. Most of those are owned by county park systems, but some of them are owned by townships, some of them are owned by cities and municipalities, some of them are owned by other nonprofits, such as the Cleveland Museum of Natural History that has a series of preserves in Northeast Ohio, some of which are open to the public, some are not. For me, I'm what's called the Vice President of Western Field Operations for the Conservancy. So you get a little bit more east of here, and that's about where my geography stops in terms of what I do for the Land Conservancy. So my role is to kind of, well, do a little bit of everything. I'm kind of a jack of all trades staff person for the Conservancy, but I'm kind of the mini CEO for about 12 counties. So I do everything from what I'm doing now to working with donors. But most of the time I spend is working on real estate transactions and preserving land, whether that's with private landowners or with government entities. But since, you know, as you migrate further west of here, it's just more and more farmland the further west you go, especially as you get out into Lorain County and then on into Huron, Erie, Richland, Ashland, Wayne. I spend a lot of my time working with farmers to preserve a lot of farmland. So I do spend a tremendous amount of time on that. And that was one of the things that the Conservancy brought me in for, is because of all that background of natural areas and biodiversity, transitioning into agricultural lands and working landscapes is a very different scenario than preservation type approaches. We also do a lot of land restoration work, more than we ever used to. More and more public grants that we obtain focus a lot more on restoration than land acquisition. So if you're doing a land purchase, land acquisition project, if you throw in some restoration along the way, you're going to be a lot more competitive. So we do a lot of land restoration work. I have several projects that involve land restoration going on right now. Probably the biggest one we're undertaking at this given moment is the one in the center in Ashtabula, Trumbull County. That stream you see there is about as straight as an arrow for 2 miles. And that's undergoing one of the largest wetland restoration projects in the state of Ohio right now as we speak. We own that property, actually. And then about, I don't know, maybe 8-9 years ago, we developed an urban arm of our organization. Since 2006, we did a little bit of urban work. I worked in some smaller towns out my way, did some work in Vermilion, some stuff near Sandusky, did a little bit in the Cuyahoga County area, not too much great in the city of Cleveland proper, but around the edges, Olmsted and some other places. And we quickly realized that if we were going to work in an urbanized landscape, we needed a dedicated team of people to do it. Because it goes well beyond just traditional conservation work where I'm buying a piece of property and it's going to go to the city or whoever runs the park. There's a lot more issues when it comes to conservation in urban areas than just the traditional work that we did. So we, between the red tape, politics, environmental issues, and so on and so forth, it would take me as much time to preserve 1 acre in a town or a city as it would for me to preserve 1,000 acres in the other counties I work in. So we needed a dedicated team of staff. So about 8-10 years ago, we developed what we call our Thriving Communities Institute, which focuses on urban landscapes. It was instrumental in bringing in over $400 million to the state of Ohio from Washington to deal with county land banks and to demolish vacant and dilapidated homes like the ones you see there. We have a massive reforestation program going on in the greater Cleveland area right now. And this is an arm of our organization that travels statewide. They go to other counties and help them establish county land banks, which are quasi-government entities that can take in foreclosed, dilapidated, abandoned properties and either one, get them back out on the market for productive use, or they become side yards for the neighbors, or it could become a pocket park type of thing in a neighborhood. So it's a variety of things, but we travel around the state to do that kind of work. We have a lot of staff on that team. Like I said, it takes a lot of people to do urban related work. I think we probably have 15 people alone working in our urban office right now. And over the years, and I'm working on one right now, where we've also got into some historic restoration projects. Typically, those have always involved some sort of land conservation component that kind of baited us a little bit. And then, but it also really the main focus of the property is some sort of historic structure, but it had the land attributes that we like as well: wetlands, rivers, streams, nice woods, those kind of things. For example, the lower left there is the Windsor White estate in the Chagrin Valley from Windsor White Motor Corporation. It was fallen apart and in total disrepair 15, 20 years ago. So we were approached to help raise funds, buy the property, preserve the property, use those funds that the owner received to develop the stables into more of a mature operation. And it's an iconic stable operation in the Chagrin Valley. The one in the top right is one that I'm working on that I have a slide on later, and that's down by Shreve. That's a historic mill down in Wayne County. Very fun project. But our story actually starts in 2006, and then actually about 20 years prior to that. Western Reserve Land Conservancy is a relatively new organization when you look at nonprofits. I kind of, being a kind of a country kid, I call ourselves a mutt of an organization because we're like what my mother would call a Heinz 57. We're the blend of 13 land trusts that have all merged together to form one organization, Western Reserve Land Conservancy. The biggest one occurred in 2006 when 8 land trusts, including the one that was in Medina and Summit County called the Medina Summit Land Conservancy, that group, as well as 7 others at that time, merged to form Western Reserve. And then we've had several others merge into it since then. It was the largest merger of land trusts ever in the United States, and we think it may have been the largest merger of separate nonprofits ever at one time as well. But at that point in 2006, all those yellow dots represent all the preserved properties that those land trusts had done prior to 2006. There's a heavy concentration in the Chagrin River Valley because the predecessor organization, the big one that really had the staff and the budget, was the Chagrin River Land Conservancy. And they were the ones that really orchestrated the whole thing. But the premise behind that is if you build enough capacity, you get a bigger organization with more staff, legal staff, project managers, fundraising staff, and all those elements that you need, we would be able to preserve far more land at a much faster pace. So when you look at that same map today, and now that represents about 8,000 acres. I just mentioned earlier, we've done 65,000 acres in only 15 years. So it exponentially elevated how much work we can do in a very short amount of time. If we were a small land trust, we wouldn't even be, incrementally even close to that. I'm the guy that goes out and finds the projects. I guess you could say I'm the salesman of the organization. So I go out and find the projects. But once I get a project and it's in our hopper, then it transitions to a project manager, the grant writers, our legal staff, and they shepherd them from start to finish. I take care of problems around the edges, so to speak. But after that, I'm working on new projects. But if I had to do everything from start to finish, we wouldn't even be anywhere close to where we're at now. So this also gives you an idea of our service area. We go everywhere from the Pennsylvania line all the way to just past Sandusky Bay and up onto the islands. I've spent a lot of time on Kelly's Island. I was working on a project just recently there, and then south down into Jefferson County. And we do some work in homes in Tuscaroras. We actually hold a couple conservation easements down in Morrow County as well. So why are land trusts needed? What is the purpose behind them? Some of it, we use Cuyahoga County because they're a nice, easy one to pick on. But one thing that you have to do is you have to get ahead of development if you're going to preserve green space. You got to start as early as possible. So when you look at Cuyahoga County around 1948, 1950, the story behind the Cleveland Metro Parks Emerald Necklace started almost another 50 years before that, really 30, 35, 40 years before 1950. That's when they laid out that emerald necklace. If they would have waited till 2002 to lay out the emerald necklace, no way, it's not going to happen. The only big addition since then in our bigger region was Cuyahoga Valley National Park, and that took an act of Congress to do. So you got to get out ahead of development to do it because the urbanization will take it over. And the funny part about this is look at that population number. About the same, 50 years later, it's the same population, but the urbanization has spread throughout all of Cuyahoga County. And as we all know, it's bled into the edges of all the other surrounding counties as well. So one thing about us is we provide an option that a lot of government agencies can't offer or don't have the capacity to offer. Working with private landowners to put permanent restrictions on property to keep them from being developed. That's kind of our bread and butter work. but we can also do a lot of the real estate work and take the load off of government agencies and park districts to do those real estate transactions. They're very complicated transactions in many cases. Some of them are simple, but I can tell you in the 15 years, the amount of simple ones I've had in real estate transactions, I could count on one hand. Most of them are extremely complex transactions. The more urban it gets, the higher the price tag they get, the more complicated they get. And we can also look at it from a regional scope. You got everybody's little county park district, you got townships, municipalities, but nobody's looking at it from a 24 county scale. So we can look at things from a 28 county scale, look at the trails that are being planned, look at the parks that this county is planning and say, how can we tie this in with the next county over, and try to do a little bit of that planning at the landscape level as well. So what do? The top one I already kind of mentioned, conservation easements. That's kind of the common denominator in most all of our protected land. And I'm going to talk about conservation easements in a minute. We also have what we call a conservation buyer program, where we have protected property that we are trying to sell, or maybe it's a private property that somebody's already put a restriction on it and they've willed it to us, or they want to sell it. We help them with those transactions to find what we call a conservation-minded buyer. So we do a lot of real estate work in that way. I already mentioned land restoration, and I've, of course, already touched on land acquisition, which I'll be talking about more extensively here in a minute. So how do I know what's the project going to do? We have to figure out what's going to happen with this. And I'm working on I'm not working on a mitigation project right now, thank goodness. Mitigation projects aren't exactly our funnest projects to do. When you have to set aside land and be enforced to it, trust me, the developer generally is only going to do the minimum required possible. And then the boundary line of that looks like this. It's all squiggly lines and stuff. But we do some mitigation work. But we do conservation easements on private land. We do a lot of land acquisition. I spend a lot of time working with private landowners like farmers and others to preserve private property. And out of most of the acres that I've done, and even as an organization, the 65,000 acres, probably around 2/3 of that is private property that has a permanent restriction on it. But the land acquisitions take most of the time. They're very time-consuming projects. I'm working with 3 different people right now on planning their estate and their wills and how to transition their land. They're looking to donate that land, transition it to us, either through life estates or by will, or whatever the case may be. So I'm working with a landowner next door in Summit County on that right now, one in Huron County and one somewhere else, can't forget the location, but those are always ongoing as well. So the biggest thing I need to know if a project is going to comes to my attention is, all right, well, what's the purpose of this property? Is it a property that these people want to retain ownership of and keep it in private ownership, or are they trying to sell the property? Those are the 2 big things I need to know right out of the gate. Is it something that's for sale, or they're looking to sell it, or do they want to keep it privately owned? Because that dictates everything after that in terms of where we're going to go with it. We have a pretty large internal process whenever we take on new projects. I'm usually the first, I don't want to say line of defense, but for lack of a better word, first line of defense. I'm the one that meets with the landowner or the seller. I go look at the property. I make a quick assessment of the property. Is it going to have what we need for conservation purposes and so on? Then I present it to a whole team of people, whether it's a farm that they want to preserve and keep it as farmland or a complex real estate transaction on Kelly's Island. I present it to a team of staff and we discuss the entire thing. How much funding are we going to need? Where are we going to make back our money on this? What are the attributes that are the highest natural resource features of it? Where are we going to find the money from? How much time is the seller going to give us? All those things are discussed in these meetings. And then we decide, is this a project we're going to move forward with or not move forward with? I mentioned cost recovery, capacity, projects already in the hopper. We are a big land trust. We're the largest in Ohio by far. We're one of the top 10 largest in the United States, but we still only have so much capacity to take on projects. So we have to determine, if it's a project that's coming up to me now, is it something that has to be done in 6 months, or can we give that a 2-year timeline? Do we have the capacity to do it in 6 months? How much grant writing do we have going on right now? Do we have the capacity to take on 3 more grants? Those are all the things that we have to weigh out. Is our legal department already buried in work? We have to, just like any other business organization, we have to weigh all those things out. Cost recovery is a big one for us. Being a nonprofit, unlike a public entity, we don't have levies. We don't receive any taxpayer dollars for the work that we do. we do get taxpayer money to buy land because most of that's public grants, federal or state money that we're getting grants for to buy land, but that doesn't cover our staff time. It only goes for the land acquisition and the closing costs, things like that. So we have to figure out, all right, if we're going to spend 2 years of time working on this $2 million project, it's going to take me, an attorney, a project manager, 2 grant writers, probably somebody on our development, traditional philanthropic fundraising staff. How are we going to pay? How are we going to get the money back that we're putting into all this? So we have to figure those things out. Otherwise we go broke, you know? So we have to figure out all those things before we move forward. And then of course we have other things that has to go through our board of trustees and so on and so forth. And the amount of scrutiny really depends on how much resources are going to be put towards the project. If I'm working with Farmer Smith down the road and he wants to preserve his farmland, it's just me, a map person, and an attorney. And that's basically it. But if I'm buying land, it's a whole team of people involved. Preserving private land. Like I said, I probably, spend, most of the land that I preserve, even as the Conservancy as a whole, most of it is private property that's still in private ownership. I like these arrangements. I don't think everything that we do has to become a public park or a public preserve. The land comes off the tax rolls. If it has farmland on it, the farmland's coming out of production. And you go into counties like Wayne, Richland, and some of these other ones you're on, and I go in front of a board of township trustees and I say, well, I'd like you to support this project of ours and pass legislation that allows us to apply for these funds. Well, yeah, those 100 acres are coming off the tax rolls. Oh yeah, and that 50 acres of farmland that's on it's also going to come out of production. You can imagine how well that goes over in some of our more rural counties. It doesn't go over very well. And even though it may be in CAUV, and we were talking about CAUV earlier, which is current agricultural use tax rates, it may not sound like a lot of money, but for a very rural township, that's a lot of money. So we have to balance that out and work with our local elected officials, and we do work with them constantly on projects. So private land conservation easements are a very good solution because it keeps all those things in use. If it's farmland, it can stay in farmland. Pays taxes, stays paying taxes. But it still stays protected. It's still protected urban space. If you think of the word easement and just break it, break it down to the word easement, it's not too much unlike any other easement that you can think of, a right-of-way easement, power line easement, a gas line easement. An easement just means that a third party holds a legal interest in that land, limited in scope to whatever that easement is for. Gas line, Columbia Gas, they have a gas line through your property. They don't own the land, but they have certain rights associated with that gas line. They can mow it. You can't build a house on it. They can keep it open. They can go back in and fix the gas line, all those kind of things. So a conservation easement is very similar in legal premise behind it, where the Land Conservancy holds a legal interest in that property, limited in scope to that conservation easement. We go and monitor the easements every year to make sure the terms are being upheld. It's not like a deed restriction. A deed restriction, landowner Smith can go to their real estate attorney and say, hey, I'd like to put a deed restriction on our property. And you can do that. You can certainly do that, but they're much weaker in a legal standing. You don't have a third party holding that legal interest. Nobody holds that legal interest. So they're challenged in court more often. They're overturned in court more often. Some attorneys in our line of work would say deed restrictions are barely worth the paper they're printed on. I think they're worth a little bit more than that, but they're certainly not nearly as effective as conservation easement. A conservation easement is pretty much the most effective way to permanently protect land today. Even if it's owned by a government agency, if it doesn't have a conservation easement on it or some other restriction on the property, they can still do whatever they want with that property. So the landowner retains ownership. Public access is not a requirement. Who landowners let on their property after they do a conservation easement is still up to them, just like before they had a conservation easement. And the only thing we care about is if the easement terms are being violated. Did somebody sign a contract with Walmart, build a Walmart in the middle of the woods? That's a problem. So we only get concerned if somebody violates the easement. It's recorded at the county recorder's office. They're all public documents. Anybody that has a conservation easement on their property, you can go to the county recorder's office and look them up if you're looking for something to read. They're about 50 pages, so they're not real fun to read. A lot of people come to us for these for tax benefits, particularly large farm operations that I'm working with. There are substantial federal income tax associated with those. I don't think my next slide gets into, I'm going to talk about taxes for a minute right here. So for many years, the federal government has had significant tax benefits for conservation easements on private property. If you're a qualified farmer right now in the eyes of the IRS, which means 50% or more of your earned income is through agricultural means, which there's a whole paragraph about what defines agricultural income. But if you're a qualified farmer, you can deduct 100% of your income against the value of a conservation easement on your tax returns. And you can carry forward what you can't use in a given tax year to the next tax year. And you have a total of 16 years to use up that deduction. Now, when I say deduction, you're like, where does that money come from? How do you do it? Well, a conservation easement has a value to it. You can have appraisers come in and determine what is that worth. And in most cases, to make it simple, it's basically what are the development rights of that property? How developable is that property, and what is that landowner giving up? You know, even if Columbia Gas or, you know, any of the big pipelines that came through recently, Rover, you know, Nexus, all of them, they still have to pay landowners for what they took. There's just an easement going through the property, but there was a value determined on how much that easement is worth. Conservation easements are pretty similar. So the easiest example where I do a lot of farmland work, let's say Huron County. Huron County, on average, the land out there, farmland's worth anywhere from 7 to 10,000 an acre for farmland. Those farmers, for doing easements, are lowering the value of their land by doing this, but they're getting about an average of $3,000 an acre in easement value. Times that by a 500-acre farm. Times that by being able to deduct 100% of your income against that tax deduction that you just made, and then being able to carry forward it until you use it up. If you're not a qualified farmer, it's limited to 50% of your adjusted gross income, but you still have the same 16 years to use it up. So if you're somebody that only makes maybe $50,000, $60,000 a year, you know, kind of the land rich, cash poor scenario, but you do an easement that's worth $500,000, you're like, well, I'm never going to use that tax deduction up in a year. Well, yeah, but you still have 16 years to use that up. And that's a huge, huge incentive for landowners to do it. It can make you essentially tax-free for many years, you know, if you do a conservation easement. So when I first started this job, the first 4 or 5 years, it was a great job. I mean, it still is a great job, but the people that were calling me were more like your 75, 85-year-old couple that own the family farm. It's been in the family for 7, 8 generations. The last thing they want to see is it covered in asphalt and shingles. So their motivation, they didn't know anything about tax incentives. And they still didn't care, because they're like, well, we're on a fixed income. I don't want to pay for an appraisal, and we're not paying taxes anyways, you know, because we're retired. You know, we don't have any income really coming in. They lease out their farm ground now, you know, those kind of things. So they just do it because they love the land. They just don't want to see it ever develop. But of course, with some of the larger farm operations that I work with now, it's a business decision. You know, it's a business decision. I'm working with one family that has done, now they've done 2,800 acres of farmland, and they do about another 100 or 200 acres every year, or every time they buy a farm. They're picking up the phone and they're calling. They would say, we bought another farm, want to put an easement on it, get it started. So they keep rolling that tax deduction. But there's also estate tax benefits. When I first had this job, and some of you probably recall, you know, in the late, what would you call those? What does that refer to? The late 2000s, before 2010. What would you call that? The late 2000s? The what? The aughts. The aughts, like a 30-ounce.
Okay.
Yeah, what? Post Y2K. You know, the federal estate tax or the death tax was only $1 million. You know, that was nothing. For even a small to modest farm operation, they might not have much in money assets, but you got 5 tractors, a combine, and 200 acres of land, you're going to hit $1 million pretty fast. So I had a lot of people coming to me because the same type of benefits can work for estate tax purposes now. It lowers the value of your assets, therefore bringing you under that estate tax threshold. Now the estate tax is what, 24 million for a married couple, I think it is. So I've only got 2 families I'm working with that actually would hit that. And it can do property tax savings. If you're in the CAUV, like I mentioned earlier, you're not going to get any property tax benefit out of it. But if you do a conservation easement and you pay full fair market taxes on your property, then you can do a conservation easement, go to the county auditor and say, hey, I put a conservation easement on my property. It's not worth as much anymore because I can't sell it for development. I can't sell frontage lots. I can't sell it to a developer for a bunch of cul-de-sacs. And here's the appraisal I had done for my tax purposes. I'd like you to reassess it for me. And they are required to reassess it. They're not required to make a change if they don't want to or agree with it, but they are required to reassess it. But in our experience, we have a fair amount of properties that are in that scenario in the Medina Summit zone, and the auditors have reassessed them and lowered their taxes. Not down to farmland rates, but certainly lower than they were paying. So how does kind of the process work? Typically, the first step is if somebody has an interest in doing this, I go and meet with them at the property. Usually it's either a walk around the property and I talk about the process while I'm doing it, or it's a sit down at the kitchen table and we just talk about, the history of the property, what they'd like to do, what would they like to see, why do they want to do this, and kind of learn a little bit about them and their property. And then I hear about, how do you want to preserve it? Do you want to do this? And then I try to throw out the things. Sometimes I have to throw out things to them to consider. They're sometimes counterproductive to conservation. But when you're talking about private property with a permanent restriction on it, those people putting that conservation easement on it now are going to someday have to sell that property, or their kids are going to have to sell that property. And they're not going to be the only ones ever living on that property. That property is going to change hands how many times? Until forever. A lot. So sometimes you need a lot of flexibility in the conservation easement. For example, somebody might come to me and they got 50 acres, doesn't have a house on it, doesn't have anything on it. And they say, well, we don't want anybody to build anything on there. And we don't want anybody to harvest any trees on there. We don't want any timber production. We don't want any oil and gas. We don't want any of that stuff. And I'm like, well, we can write a conservation easement that does that. But if you lock up that timber permanently, even if it's just on paper, it could knock you out of CAUV tax rates. The county auditor is going to catch up with you eventually. And you're going to come out of that property tax valuation because now harvesting timber is not allowed on that property. There's no home site on it. Somebody's going to want to buy that property. It's going to be a lot harder to sell without an existing home or an envelope somewhere where somebody can build a house on it. So I try to throw those options out to them. So I talk about commercial timber harvesting. I talk about oil and gas exploration. I talk about reserved home sites. I talk about excluding portions of the property if they want to. A conservation easement doesn't have to follow parcel lines. It can be, a different configuration. It doesn't quite have to follow parcel lines. It's nice when it does. It makes it clean and simple, but they don't certainly always do that. So once I gather that information from them and I get the go-ahead from them, then they're like, yeah, we want to go for it. Let's take the next step. Then I feed all of that information to one of our attorneys. We have 2 full-time attorneys on staff and a paralegal on staff. And I say, all right, this guy, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, they want to do a conservation easement. It's either, we have kind of 3 main templates that we use. One is pure farmland. It's farmland from inch to inch. And as you guys know, as you go further west and drive towards Sandusky, it's not surprising that I could have tracts of land that is farmland from inch to inch. I mean, everything is farmland. So we have easements that are just for pure farmland. We have easements that are just for pure natural lands. And then what we probably do the most of are what we call a hybrid of the 2, where yes, it's a 100-acre farm. They got 75 acres of tillable ground on it. And then they got 25 acres of woods in the back. So it's a little bit of a blend of both. So I tell them, well, I need this. They want to do 1 reserved home site. They have an existing building area. They want to have commercial timber harvest, and it has to have agricultural language in it. So then we give them first draft. I go out and I meet with that landowner and I go over that document paragraph by paragraph, not word for word, but paragraph by paragraph. Average conservation easement is going to have about 25 to 30 pages. They're not small documents. They're not insignificant. But I try to take the sting out of it so everybody doesn't have to sit down and read all that legalese that's in it. Here's, this paragraph here that's, a half a page long. This is what it means. There's a paragraph that says no dumping. The premise behind it is we don't want your property to become a landfill. No recreational vehicles. We don't want it to become a motocross course. And then they're like, well, we like to ride our 4-wheelers once in a while. We go around the property and the grandkids come over and go around the property. And I'm like, well, every time you take a ride on your 4-wheeler, are you monitoring your property too? And they're like, yeah. Well, I'm like, don't worry about it. We're trying to prevent it from becoming a motocross course. So I try to go over every provision of those easements with them in detail. Then after they've had time to review that easement on their own, give it to their attorney if they choose, let their attorney review it. I come back to them, I go over the revisions, let them know if one of them is going to be a problem or not, but then basically I give it to our attorney. They give me back a red line version so that the landowner can see everything that's been added and everything that's been deleted. And then we go over that. Usually after the first revision, it's minimal after that, but there's usually some tweaks. Once that's done, that second draft is in their hands, that's when I kind of pull the trigger for our map people. And I'm like, all right, we're ready for you to go out and document the property. A conservation easement is basically a Microsoft Word document. It's just a bunch of text. And it says, thou shalt not, in different paragraphs. But it doesn't say the property is this and it looks like that and they have a house here and they got this over there and the da-da-da-da-da and all that stuff. So once I know the easement is close to being a final format, Then I have one of our staff people come out and they walk the entire property. Usually I've already walked it anyways, but they go out with more of a purpose behind it. They go out and they take photographs looking down each of the property lines. They take photographs of the infrastructure. They take other representative photographs of the property. They put together a series of maps about the property. And then they do a brief summary of what the conservation easement terms are. And then they put together a separate document. We call it the baseline document because it serves as here's the baseline of the way this property looked when this person did that conservation easement. So every year when we go back and do an annual visit, and we go back and we visit every property annually that we hold a conservation easement on, we know what that property looked like then, because it could be a different staff person. They have no clue what that property looked like, 10 years ago whenever we did the conservation easement. But we have so much farmland under easement now. Some of our annual visible inspection visits are actually done by a couple volunteer pilots who need to keep their pilot hours up. So they go out, they take aerial photos. There's no point in having a staff person go out and walk 500 acres of soybeans, but they'll go out and take aerial photographs, send it back to us. But we still meet with those landowners personally every year. We want to keep that relationship good. I'm the front end person. So when it comes to a conservation easement on private property, there aren't project managers involved or anything like that. I'm the person the landowner works with from start to finish. But once that easement is done, they don't see me that much. I'm not the guy that goes out to do that monitoring visit. So we have to keep that relationship going, and we want to have a good relationship with our landowners. So we still maintain those relationships throughout. There's sometimes title issues. We do have to review title. We do require, I wouldn't say require, but we do request a charitable pledge. So if we do a conservation easement on somebody's property, we have to make sure that we have the financial resources to do what we say we're going to do. From a legal standpoint, people are going to say conservation easements are a liability on your financial books. They're a drain. They cost money. Every easement doesn't matter what the easement is, they cost money to hold easements. There's obviously, like any industry, there's industry standards for what we do too. Land trusts are supposed to have restricted endowment funds set up that there's two pots of money that we have. One is for annual monitoring and the other one is for legal defense of those easements. The industry has said that it costs a land trust about $30,000 to hold a conservation easement on average. That's what it's going to cost you over, let's say, a 75-year span of time to hold them. Some may have no legal issues for 25 years, and one property may have 5 legal issues in 10 years. It's all over the place. So we do request a charitable gift when we do a conservation easement, and it's not insignificant money either. It's a $7,500 charitable gift that we request when we do a conservation easement. Out of that $7,500, $5,000 of that is divided up and put into those 2 restricted pots of money. The $2,500 that's on top of that goes to cover the title work and the recording fees. An easement's going to cost about $1,000 just to get recorded, because the easement and the baseline combined are about 60 pages altogether. So it costs a lot of money. So we do request that whenever we do a conservation easement. It's unfortunate, but we do it. And, it's very difficult. And, sometimes whenever I go back to our main office or I'm presenting a new project to somebody, being the guy that's sitting across the kitchen table from that 91-year-old widow who owns the family farm and has been her family for 6 generations. And then I got to start talking about that $7,500. You can just see the expression just leave their face. They're going from exciting to maybe be able to preserve the family farm. They're like, how am I going to come up with $7,500? It's a hard discussion to have at times. Some people don't even blink an eye over it, but obviously a lot of people do. It's a lot of money. Somebody on a fixed income, $7,500, that's a lot of money. But I have had a lot of retired folks do it, and instead of having their IRAs or their retirement funds come to them for their annual distribution, they'll call Edward Jones or whoever it is and say, hey, I'd like $7,500 of my annual distribution to go directly to Western Reserve Land Conservancy. That way it doesn't come to them and they get taxed on it, and then they send it to us. So I've had quite a few people do it that way. You don't have to have an appraisal. Like I said, if you're not planning to take a tax deduction or go to your county auditor and have them try to reassess it, there's no purpose in having an appraisal done. The appraisals aren't cheap. An appraiser usually is basically doing 2 appraisals in one. They're looking at what's this property worth right now before the easement's put on it in the market that they're in, just like any other appraisal is done. And then they look at the terms of that conservation easement. And they say, well, based on all these limitations and restrictions you're putting on the property is going to be worth X amount of money after that. So if it's worth $10,000 an acre now, before you put the easement on it, then it's going to be worth $7,000 an acre after you put the easement on it. And it varies across the board as to how much that tax deduction and that easement value is worth. you know, you guys are in an area where you got high property values. Somebody has 100 acres in Hinckley Township with a ton of road frontage on it, and especially if they have water lines on it or something, and they put a restriction on that whole property, says, nope, no more houses, no more nothing. That easement value is going to be substantial. I live in North Ridgeville, Lorain County. If I had a 50-acre bean field in North Ridgeville with 3 sides of road frontage with water and sewer lines down all 3 sides, and I put a conservation easement on it, my value probably went from $35,000 an acre down to $5,000 an acre in value. But my tax deduction is going to be huge. But if I had a big swamp in the middle of nowhere and put a conservation easement on it, that value may not change at all, because you really couldn't do much with it from a development standpoint prior to that. So, and it's everything in between. So kind of what I hinted to earlier, you know, my most favorite part of my job, what I love to do is working with these people like you see here. You know, all they care about is preserving that family heritage. They've been in Northeast Ohio long enough, you know, you're talking, you know, 20s, 30s, 40s, even the early 50s, and they've seen what has taken place from a development standpoint in the past 25 years. And I've only lived in Ohio since 95, late 94, early 95 when I came here. And just in that North Ridgeville area alone, the amount of land that's gone for residential development is just mind-boggling, just mind-boggling. But these are the most fun people to work with. They're not in it for the money. They just want to preserve that family land. And they're kind of like the people I grew up with, my aunts and uncles, my family. When it comes to farmland, we've done everything. Big grain operations, big livestock operations, small organic operations, and everything in between. So we've done, you know, our easements work pretty good for preserving agricultural land. One of the first things I tell a farmer is I'm like, look, we don't want to tell you how to farm. Our easement doesn't say how you have to farm. You only need to contact us is if you have a reserved home site in your easement and somebody wants to build that house. Then they have to contact us. If you're going to do a commercial timber harvest, we need to know about that. But if you're going to put in new tiling or trim back the limbs from the edge of the field or convert this field from corn to beans or from tilling to no tilling or convert it into, we don't want to know any of that stuff. I mean, it's nice, but we don't need to. You know, we don't want to feel like that we're in their face to manage their property. The other thing I tell them, usually right out of the gate, is just remember perpetuity is a really long time. And so this is something you really want to think through. We can do a conservation easement in as short as 6 to 8 weeks. We've done a couple that quickly, but none of us, even on our side of the fence, want to do them that quickly because it's a recipe for a problem. In about 2, 3, 4, 5 years, somebody's going to give us a phone call and say, well, we kind of screwed up. And then we got to be like, well, it's too late. You know, it's done. There are changes you can make. Every easement has what's called an amendment provision to it, where changes can be made to the easement document. But there's certain rules governing that as to whether we can make the changes or not. If it has a negative impact on conservation, we can't make that change. If it's a neutral outcome, we can sometimes make that change. If it's a positive outcome, we can absolutely make that change. And we can't give anybody a private monetary benefit for changing an easement document either. We're a 501c3 charitable organization. If we made a change to a document that gave somebody a windfall of money, we could jeopardize our charitable status. So we have to be careful about making changes, yes.
If you have an easement on your property and you've already paid the charitable $7,500,
yes.
And you add property, do you pay more? Or
you'll pay more, but it won't be $7,500. No.
Can you repeat the questions?
Oh, yeah, yes. The question was, if you already have an easement on your property and you've paid the $7,500 already, and then you either have more land or you buy more land that's beside it and you want to add it to the easement, right, is there an additional cost? And the answer is yes, but it's not another $7,500. The provision in our easement about amendments says that the landowner has to pick up the costs associated with doing an amendment, which is generally a little bit of staff time, new recording costs, and title work. So on average, an amendment's going to maybe be $2,000, $3,000, maybe $4,000 to make that change. So you don't want to do it for a 1 acre lot. Generally, you want to make it, you know, worth the effort to do it, or worth the money to do it. I guess is a better way to say it. And then we also have another provision in there that gives us a little bit of discretionary approval to give approval for. You know, nobody has a crystal ball. When we do a written document like a conservation easement, nobody can see into the future and anticipate changes. So. But we also don't want to have to go through an amendment process every time there's an issue. So if there's an issue that doesn't warrant itself to go through an entire amendment process, which is a committee of our staff, a committee of our board, and then to our board of trustees, we have what we call discretionary approval in our easement. So for an example, one that I had on my side of town many years ago is somebody reserved a future home site. I don't know what it was, 2 acres, 1.5 acres, something like that. But when they came to build the house, a son of the family went to build this new house, and the health department came out to do the septic. Well, they wouldn't allow them to put the septic in that footprint. So we're like, well, we're not going to make a change. So we just kind of, said, yeah, just, run the septic to wherever the health department told you had to do it. So not a huge deal. Now, conservation easements can be purchased. I talked about how they're valued by an appraisal purposes. In some cases, they can be purchased using grant funds to do that with. Probably the most well-known of those is for farmland. The state of Ohio, as well as the Farm Bill at the federal level, both have an agricultural easement purchase program that they operate. And we've helped many landowners get through the state of Ohio one. We just completed one that I've been working on for a couple of years here in Medina County in Lafayette Township. It's now, I think, the biggest single piece of property that we've preserved. That's all together, I think it's 162 acres in Lafayette Township. And that was a family that went through the state of Ohio's program through the Ohio Department of Agriculture. Well, they'll pay you a certain amount of money, not the full value, but they'll pay you a certain amount of money for putting a permanent agricultural easement on those farms. And I have 3 more farms lined up to apply to that program in early 2022. So we do help people go through that program. It sounds great, and I get a lot of phone calls for that because there'll be a press release out on them and stuff like that. But it's not the best for everybody. It's not a one-size-fits-all deal. It's a good fit for some families. It's not a good fit for other farm operations. But I go over all that when I go to meet with somebody that wants to learn about it. But there are grant funds that can purchase non-agricultural based easements on private property too. There's a grant source in the state of Ohio called the Clean Ohio Fund. Some of you may have heard of it. And actually the Clean Ohio Fund is 4 different pots of money. It was voted on in, I want to say 99, 2000, somewhere in there before I was doing this line of work. And it's been in the state of Ohio ever since. It's gone back to the ballot box once since then. And it was unanimously reapproved in all counties, in all 88 counties in Ohio. So it's a very popular program. And we use particularly 2 pots of that money. The Ohio Department of Agriculture's Farmland Preservation Program is funded through that pot of money. And then there's a green space component too, which is probably the bread and butter funding source for a lot of the land acquisitions that we do, your county park systems, Medina Park System, Cleveland Metro Parks, you name it, they've all used the Clean Ohio's Green Space Fund to help them acquire land. We use it all the time. And it's spread out across the state. Summit County or Medina County has their little group of counties that they've worked with for their little pots of money in that, but we work all across 24 counties to help secure what's called Clean Ohio funding for land acquisitions. But then there's a trail fund, which we've done a little bit of, and then there's a brownfield redevelopment pot of money too, which we haven't tapped into yet, at least to any extent. But the Clean Ohio Green Space Fund, as well as a couple other ones, one at the federal level too, you can buy a conservation easement on private property with that funding, but it's very, very competitive. The grants that we use to either buy easements with or to buy land with, always have to remember, it's like any other grants out there. You got this much money and this many people trying to get it. So a conservation easement on private property is not going to rank as well in an application as a park district trying to buy land for public access. They just don't compete well against each other. Now, in some cases, you can hit a round of grant applications where they don't have enough applications to spend all their money. So sometimes you get lucky. Not usually, but sometimes you do. But for example, that one at the top there is a 400-acre Boy Scout camp in the edge of Lorain County. It has numerous rare species on it. It has part of the Vermilion River in it. It's a Boy Scout camp that's used for all other kinds of things besides Boy Scouts. It had a lot of wetlands on it, so it had a lot of the stuff that made it compete pretty well in those grant funding circles, even though it's a private property. I'm actually doing a grant. Well, I'm not. Our grant writer is, but I'm helping her to do a grant on a property down in Stark County right now. That would be a small easement purchase on private property, but it has a lot of nice attributes. So like I mentioned earlier, land acquisitions is where most of our time is spent because they can be very time consuming, but that's the work that we do. We love doing the work. So we do a lot of pre-acquisition for government agencies and other nonprofits. At the end of the day, we consider ourselves specialists in real estate transactional work. As much as we're a conservation organization, Oftentimes what it boils down to at the end of the day is real estate transactional work. And sometimes it can be pretty complex. So for us to take on a complex real estate transaction, it's a lot better or a lot more inexpensive for a government entity or a county park district to use us for all that kind of stuff than to pay their own staff or to hire consultants or to do all the work themselves. It takes a lot of time. I mean, most of the Clean Ohio grants that we write to buy property, by the time we're submitting one, of course, now it's mostly electronic, but first 10 years of my job, we were submitting, they were as thick as your average old phone book when we would submit those grants. So they're not insignificant pieces of work to put together. Out of the 65,000 acres, we probably own about 6,000 acres, but we try not to get into the land ownership world. Like I said earlier, we don't have levy funds coming into us to maintain property with, like a park district would, to maintain it. So more often than not, when we're buying land, we're doing it on behalf of another entity. And oftentimes those grants are written in the name of the other entity, because some grants we're not even eligible for as a 501c3. You have to be a political subdivision to apply to those. So we do them in the name of whatever political subdivision that we're working in. But we do own a few pieces of land. We cultivate all those entities, all those funding sources that we get money from. We have lobby firms. As staff, we meet with the heads of those agencies. We keep them apprised of everything that we're doing. And it pays off. I just got a phone call from somebody with ODNR who works in their coastal management office in Sandusky, probably 3 weeks ago now. And they said, and it's also a guy who knows us because he's in our 4-H club, but we've got him from there before. He said, hey, we got $250,000 of federal money. It's NOAA money, National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration money. We got to get rid of it. We got to spend it. Otherwise, we got to give it back. What do you guys got that you can put this money into before June 30th of next year? So, of course, immediately I'm on the phone with my couple other counterparts. What do we got? What do we got that meets these criteria and it can be done by June of 2023 or 2022? So send them an email up. Here's 3 projects to consider. So cultivating those entities who dole out that money or the money's funneled through is a very good thing to do. So whenever I go to buy a piece of property, I'm looking at a few attributes to even know if it's going to be a project or not. First one, is it a willing seller? And obviously, if they're looking to sell land, then obviously they're a willing seller, but that's not what I mean by a willing seller. I need a willing seller that's willing to give us the time to find that money. We may be the biggest land trust in Ohio, one of the biggest in the US, but we're also not the Bank of America. We don't have some vault in the back room to just, take money out. We're not Washington. We don't have this magic money that's coming to us all the time. So I need landowners that give us time to find that money. For example, I just made an offer on a 27-acre piece on Kelly's Island, $1.5 million property. I didn't offer $1.5 million, but over $1 million for sure. And I told the realtor involved, I said, look, if they can't give us at least 1 full year of time, then we probably can't do this because we just missed a big grant cycle. And a lot of those grants, like any other grants, they happen annually. And if you just miss it, you're waiting a whole other year to put your application in the door. So I need usually at least a year. And no one grant's going to give you all the money anyways. You got to go to other grants to find it, to find the rest of the money. So are the sellers willing to give us the amount of time needed to find it? Generally, we like to get at least 12 months of time. We'll do them a little shorter sometimes, but generally 12 months is probably the average. I prefer 24 if I can get it. Then as I look at the property, I'm like, all right, what funding sources could we use for this? I'm thinking through my mind, this could be Clean Ohio, this could be this could be that. So I'm like, yeah, this is pretty fundable because it has a creek, it has wetlands, it's got pretty mature woods, it's on the lake, it's got this, it's got that. All that warm and fuzzy stuff that the grant sources like to see. Then who's going to be the long-term owner? If I have to take this back to my team and say, well, I don't really have what we call a takeout partner like Hinckley Township or Medina Park District. If I don't have one of those lined up, then I'm like, well, I don't have a takeout partner yet. We may have to own this. Then it really gets scrutinized very heavily. If we have to own it long-term, how are we going to maintain and manage that property? We can find the money to buy property with, but there are grants out there that give you money to put the new culvert in or to put gravel in the parking lot or to maintain your trails. You got to have the money to do that. Now, we opened up 5 properties to the public early last year because of COVID. We all know that all of our parks were jammed because of COVID. Everybody wanted to get outside. You couldn't even really find a parking spot at many of our parks. So us on our senior management team were like, what properties do we have right now that if with minimal work, we can open them up to the public? So We opened up 5 properties last year to the public. Actually, the 5th one was fairly recent. It's up near the Metro Park Zoo near Cleveland, or in Cleveland. But we also didn't have a property manager on staff. We don't have anybody to go out and maintain property. You know, the people who maintain property is 20% of my time, 10% of that guy's time, 20% of her time. So it was a hodgepodge of all of us going out to maintain properties. So we've hired a property manager. Then it's like, all right, well, how are we going to get the money to maintain these as a public park or a nature preserve without having tax money come in? So our model that we were using, and we still are using it, is like, all right, well, if we have a 50-acre property that we want to have as an open preserve, and it's going to have a parking lot, it's going to have a restroom, it's going to have a mile and a half of trails. Those trails have 50 yards of boardwalk and 5 culverts involved. What's it going to cost to annually maintain that property? And we come up with a number. We have a cost calculator system that spits all that stuff out. So if it's going to cost us $50,000 to maintain that property every year, we need to have an endowment set up of X amount of money to pull off enough interest to give us that $50,000 every year. And that's kind of the model we look at. And it's not an easy model to come up with, you know, and try to come up with that money. You know, if it's a property, you know, the seller's coming to me saying, well, I want to sell it. I'm like, well, I don't have anybody who's going to own it except for us. And we don't know how we're going to fund it. We got to start with an endowment fund. We got to fundraise. We got to do all this stuff. So it's a much more complicated decision on our end before we even take it to our board of trustees. And you can see, you know, what I put up there in terms of buying land. It's much more staff involved and much more intensive to get worked on. And they can follow all sorts of paths. You got internal vetting, you got writing grants, you got maybe environmental assessments that need done. Is there a restoration component? Is it going to be just public funding involved? Or do I have to pull in our development staff that does our traditional fundraising and start talking to individual donors or community foundation or the Cleveland Foundation or whatever foundation it may be? How is it we're going to be coupled all together? And they can be quite long projects. We've had some that have drug out for multiple years because they're big price tags or there's different phases involved and there's a lot to do. Maybe it has an environmental issue that needs to be dealt with. It has a major title issue that's going to take 6 months to resolve. So there's a lot of things that go into each and every project. I talked a little bit about funding options. There's quite a bit of them out there. It doesn't mean that they're easy to get, but there's a fair amount of funding options, but they're all competitive. You know, there is no one magic bullet for a funding source to buy land with. Clean Ohio is, like I said, the most lucrative one that most of us use a lot of, but there's other ones out there. Nature Works and Land and Water Conservation Fund are very good programs too. Land and Water Conservation Fund, you can see that one. That's a federal source of money. It's probably my favorite one out of all of them because I think it's very versatile. A park district, township, whoever can use that to do everything from building a pavilion or a restroom or to buy land. You know, it's a very versatile pot of money. Land and Water is funded through offshore oil well and gas well tax revenues. It's been in place since the late 60s. So there's a lot of them out there. But they ebb and flow too. You know, in every new administration in Washington, it changes a little bit. You know, what's available now isn't going to be available in 4 years. The State House, same thing. So you really got to stay on top of what the changes are in funding. We're very good at doing the match game. If you're familiar with grants, even in the little bit of way, I already mentioned that none of them give you all the money. You know, there are very, very few that'll give you all the money to do the entire project. Some of them will give you 50%, some will give you 75%, some will only do this. And of course, nobody wants to be the first money in, and everybody wants to be the last money in, you know. So trying to do the matching of funds is very challenging, but we're very good at it. It's like playing a shell game almost. But you can see this is a good example of one grant. NACA stands for North American Wetland Conservation Act. That's what that stands for. And it spans Mexico, United States, and Canada. It's mainly a big ducks unlimited pot of money. Basically, our motto for NACA, if we're going to look at putting what we call NACA money into a project, it better be what we call ducky. If it's not ducky, it's probably not going to do well at that funding source, you know, because they want duck habitat. But that one big grant that we got was able to spur matching dollars with all those other projects that you see up there and other funding sources, all coming off of one grant. Now that's, you know, quite an exasperated one. Usually they're not that complicated, but we have to get good at that if you're going to get into this work. So I look at natural resource attributes first and foremost. Does it have those ingredients, the wetlands, the creeks, the streams, the woods, rare birds? We go out and we send volunteers out to all these properties, sometimes staff. We have very good staff. I'm pretty good at some of it too. I'm mostly good with my trees, but my coworker in the Lorain County area, she's very good at plants. We have Natural History Museum staff that go out and survey these properties. We have various Audubon clubs that go survey properties. We have to collect that data when we go to submit those grants. And even if I'm still talking to a seller and I don't have it under a purchase agreement yet, and let's say it's August or September like it is now, and I know I'm probably not going to get under contract for probably another 2 months, the snow's going to be flying. We're not going to be able to go out there and see much. I asked them, can we get people onto the property now? Because I got to get that list built up of birds, plants, trees, and all that kind of stuff. Birds are one of the best, because they're more tangible. There's far more lists out there about what's rare, endangered, threatened, and so on and so forth. We also use bat monitoring devices, acoustic monitoring devices for bat species. We have 3 devices that we'll put up on a property for about a 2 or 3 week period. It's a little microphone up on a pole, goes to a thing on a tree about the size of a trail camera, and it records all the echolocation sounds of all the bat species that it picks up. We take that data, send it to an expert. They tell us what bat species are on that property. All bats are some sort of state listed status, whether it's endangered, rare, or threatened. And all those give us the leg up on the competition for those grants. But not all of them just look at that stuff. The Clean Ohio Fund that I mentioned earlier, there's questions in those applications about, well, is it an underserved community? What kind of economic situation is the community in or the county in? Does it help to serve schools? Is it a direct connection to schools or isn't it a direct connection to schools? So there's other attributes that try to help balance the playing field a little bit there. If all the things they funded were high category wetlands, you're not going to get a lot of projects that way because we just don't have a ton of them. One that I'm finishing up right now is next door in Summit County. It's a project that I like. I wouldn't say it's probably the best of all worlds, but it's definitely a project that I've liked because it has a lot of nice things about it. This is a 45-acre property. It's just barely in Hudson. It's near the Hudson Stowe line. I wish I could. Can you see my cursor? Dang, I can't. All right, that's better. So when I first looked at this property, it was on the real estate market. And actually a friend of ours in Hudson sent me the real estate listing and said, hey, maybe you guys want to check this out. I looked at it on a map and I saw this red line. I'm like, oh, there's a hike and bike trail right beside it already, a Summit Metro Parks hike and bike trail. And then I went to look at the property and you see that little tiny cutout right in there? That's a historic cemetery that dates back to 1816. And it was an old community in the Hudson area before Hudson was as big as it was. It was its own little community. So what I liked about this is it had the hike and bike trail right beside it. It has another up and coming hike and bike trail on the other side of it. It has a cultural aspect to it. It had great wetlands. It already had some trails on it, kind of. It has a couple streams on it. So it had some really nice elements to make it a fairly diverse project. Cultural elements, natural resource elements, and the recreational aspects. I love it whenever we can do a little bit more than that. We own a property now in Richland County near Mansfield that the seller was fairly charitable, so we were able to reduce how much we had to ask for in money. It's a 270-acre property, and we kept 10 acres out of it altogether from all the grant, because all those grants that we get, they say, well, if you use our money, you're putting these restrictions on that property, which is, a legitimate thing to do. But it limits what the districts can do, park districts. Most of these grant funds are for what are referred to as passive parks, meaning they're more natural type parks. Pretty much all the grants that we get, you're not going to put soccer fields or baseball fields on. It's for passive parks. But, in some cases, it's nice to have a little bit of both. And my kids are a little older now, but when my kids were 2, 3, 4, 5 years old, they're not going to want to go to a 270-acre property and hike trails. You get away with that for about 20 minutes, half hour maybe, but then it's hitting the playground after that, and then it's a picnic at the pavilion. So it's nice to have some areas that are set aside for those type of recreational uses, especially if it's in a more urbanized setting. Oh, 55 acres. So I mentioned it had all these elements to it. Now, this is one of those ones where I was like, oh my gosh, this is coming to my attention. And it was in December of last year, actually. It's January rolling up, and I'm like, my gosh, there's no birds, there's no nothing. It's all a bunch of ice and snow. We're not going to find anything. And that Clean Ohio grant from Summit County area was due the 1st of April. And I'm like, I got 3 months to find stuff on this property, and there's snow everywhere. What we didn't know is this was a birding hotspot. This historic cemetery, going back that lane to the historic cemetery, is owned by the city of Hudson already. And the birders have been clamoring over this for decades. They've been back there. So they had extensive lists of birds that were already on the property, which helped us tremendously in our funding for this. And then it had those other things I mentioned there earlier. And we are going to do about 3 years of invasive species treatment on that property. We're talking to the city of Hudson now about them being the long-term owners of this property. Another one that is kind of more of a passion of mine is the one I mentioned a little bit earlier down in Wayne County. It's a historic grist mill. The reason why I like it is one of the state parks I worked at in Pennsylvania, which is also close to where I grew up, had an old historic grist mill on the property, and I was the naturalist there, and I gave tours of this mill, and I kind of become the expert of that mill, as well as a lot of the mills in that Slippery Rock, Western PA area. So I have a real affinity for old mills. I like old stuff in general. I got lots of crap. Old tractors, old stuff. I don't even tell my wife half. She'll be like, where'd that come from? I don't know. But this is a very cool. When I walked into this mill, it's not your picturesque postcard Vermont mill and the steep ravine with, nice forested hillsides. So it was just that old structure. You see it in the top right. I'm like, oh yeah, that's pretty cool. And then I went in it, and every piece of machinery was still in it, which is pretty cool. Every piece of machinery was still in it. At the time, it was still powered by a water wheel, and it's going to be again. So it was powered by an 18-foot water wheel. It not only was a grist mill, most mills focused on one thing. It was a grist mill, and then maybe 20 years later, a new buyer turned it into a different type of mill. But this one is a grist mill, sawmill, wood shop mill, and a cider press operation all in one building, which is extremely unusual. I've never even heard of a mill that had that kind of simultaneous operations going on. And then one of the guys that owned that mill in the 20s, no, it was actually in the late 1880s, 1890s, he built a machine that custom built parts that were sent to other mills all across North America at the time. So this mill had connections to mills throughout North America around that late 1800s, early 1900s time. And this functioned commercially through the 70s with a water wheel, which is unheard of as well. So Wayne County doesn't really have a park district. They do on paper. They have a park district, but they have no money, no staff, no levy, no anything like that. So we're like, well, we can't let this go to the wayside. It also came with 15 acres of rare wetlands that have some really rare species on it. Long story short, we're finishing up the restoration. That lower picture is the picture I took about, 3 weeks ago down there. Put a ton of money into the restoring of the overall structure. Myself and the former owner of the mill are going to restore the machinery, and then he's going to rebuild the water wheel for us next summer. So we're going to operate as an education, as a tourist attraction in that area. Still powered by the water wheel. And then I spent a lot of time on Kelly's. We've done a lot of work on Kelly's Island. Unfortunately, the deal I mentioned to you earlier, I sent it to them on a Friday, and they took another cash offer on a Saturday. So I'm out of luck on that one. But nonetheless, we still are always looking at land on Kelly's Island. The village of Kelly's Island's village council, the parks board, fair amount of the residents don't want Kelly's Island to become South Bass Island. They don't want it to become the next Put-in Bay. So they're really trying to keep it as much of a rural thing as you can, but it's a tough balance, especially when you get into the tax roll situation. Look at how much of that land is already off tax rolls. If it's green or yellow, it's not paying taxes right now. So that makes it tough. So you get to have a fine line where it gets to be, or you can't really do much more and absorb it from a tax-based standpoint. Sometimes they're small. We look at projects for buying 20 acres, actually, but almost all of our projects that we do, whether it's a conservation easement on private property or a land acquisition project, 20 acres is kind of our gray number that we look at. If it falls below 20 acres, we start looking very closely at the context of that property. Because when we hold these restrictions on it or put all that time and effort into doing a project, it has to have the resource attributes that makes it worth all that time and effort. So is it on the shores of Lake Erie? Is it against an existing park? Is it a private property that's going to have a lot of natural area restrictions on it? Or is it a 16 or 15 acre property and 5 acres of it is mowed lawn, an acre of it is house and garage and a pole building, and then they got a 2 acre pond in the back, and then really it's only 5 acres of woodland. So are we going to hold a conservation easement on stuff like this? So we have to weigh all that out. And if we take small properties to our board of trustees, anything under 15, 20 acres, they're like, why are you guys taking this to us when you could be doing 200 acres somewhere else? So we have to look at all those pretty closely when it comes to smaller land. Doesn't mean that we don't do them. But, you know, for example, here's a 2.2 acre property I did in Marblehead several years ago. Lakeshore became a public park, complicated, tons of money involved, $2 million project. But, you know, it had those attributes that warranted us putting our resources behind making that happen. And I know Hinckley's in an area where you don't have, you know, the farmers that are farming 500 acres right now. You know, you just don't have that left. But does that mean that we're not going to work on anything in Hinckley Township that's under 20 acres? No, it doesn't. Anybody that's interested. Now, if it was 2 acres, yeah, probably don't call me. But if it's 10, 15, 20, a little over 20, call me. I'll come look at it. Or I'll at least look at it on an aerial map and say whether I brought up the flagpole. Some of them are big. This one was really a big game changer in terms of Lake Erie shoreline. You know, there's only about 15% of Lake Erie shoreline that's publicly accessible and preserved. This involved over 600 acres total, 2 miles of Lake Erie shoreline, Lake County. It's owned by Lake Metro Parks now, but it took a long time to do it. But it was one of those projects that was really, you know, when you look at a lot of the parks and other things that we've done, they're great properties to preserve, but there's only very few that rise to like, man, this is a major conservation significance to get this project done. This is one. And I open this up to any questions in-house or anybody on Zoom if they can send anything or call out. Yes.
I have another question.
Yes.
There are other entities that you can have a conservation easement with, the park system, whatever. What is the difference between your organization and, say, the Cleveland Metro Parks?
Well, each one's going to have their own criteria for what they're going to hold a conservation easement on. If any government entity technically can hold conservation easements, but most of them don't because that's not their business to do it. You know, they don't want to hold those easements. Some county soil and water conservation districts hold conservation easements, some of them don't. Most park districts, countywide park districts at least, do hold some conservation easements, but generally they're more interested in stuff that adjoins their properties. You know, they don't want the development to creep in right on their edges in many cases. So they'll hold conservation easements in certain cases, but they're not going to hold it on big open farmland generally, unless it's right up against it and they don't want that to become a subdivision. Then they might hold
and I would assume that they are a political entity, and if the tide turns politically, then there could be some ramifications in terms of conservation, possibly?
Yeah, although I'm not sure if I understand the question. I didn't even have to repeat the question. I got to repeat the questions for everybody on.
But maybe I should repeat it so we can all understand. If the park systems are political entities and they're funded publicly.
Yes.
So if the
You don't have to hold it close, just hold it down.
She'll hold it.
Good job.
Yeah. The park systems are public entities. They're political entities and they're funded that way. Yes. If they hold a conservation easement as opposed to your organization and the political climate changes, would there be a difference in
Well, there could be, but the conservation easement can't be removed.
Okay.
So conservation easements cannot be removed by the entity that holds the easement, and they can't be removed by the landowner that owns the land. Anybody can challenge it in court. You can go to a court and try to challenge a conservation easement. And eminent domain can squelch a conservation easement. Eminent domain conservation easements have blocked eminent domain, and then there's other cases where they haven't blocked eminent domain. Just depends on how big a muscle, is pushing that eminent domain. So, a park district or somebody could take a property to court and say, we hold a conservation easement on this. We want to get rid of this conservation easement. Then the judge technically should be looking at why was this easement put in place before? And if the reason for this easement no longer exists, then maybe a judge would agree to that. Sometimes there have been nefarious reasons for putting conservation easements on property, and they were caught in IRS tax court, for that reason. So in those cases, they've been, in some cases, taken off.
We've talked to you about
Yes.
the conservation easement on our property.
Mm-hmm.
And I just lost my train of thought. So carry on.
That's all right. I mean, the question was really about, are there other entities that can hold easements? And yes, there are. And then as those entities change, could the status of those easements change as well?
Right. And the other question I remembered, good for me, is have easements been challenged in court, and have you had to defend easements?
Oh, yes. Yeah, we've had to defend
For
several.
private landowners.
Yes, several. I would say, I hate to use the word violation because it makes it sound like a regulatory agency or something,
Right.
but we're not. But we always have easement violations at any given time. Most of them are very, very minor and we avoid a court issue at all costs. Nobody wants to do that. Especially when it comes to private land, because I can assure you that our reputation, my reputation, and the willingness of somebody to put a conservation easement on private property is going to rely on the reputation of what we do. And farmers especially, they talk to each other. And Farmer Joe talks to Farmer Smith and he says, well, I did one and it sucked. They're not, the other guy's not going to do it. So we have to be cautious, but we will put our money where our mouth is if push comes to shove. And we've done it, many times. I wouldn't say many, but several times. Let's put it that way.
So if heirs, for example, challenged.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay.
We've done that. We've had developers.
Not that ours would.
We've had developers buy land with a conservation easement and say, well, the person that did that easement wasn't in the right mental capacity to make those kind of decisions. And we've gone to court. We've had witnesses come in and say, oh, no, they knew exactly what they were doing. Too bad.
Okay, thank you.
We've had people doing a timber operation on an adjoining property come across the property lines and take, several acres of timber off neighbors' properties that we have easements on. And no owner didn't even know about it. Sometimes we find them on our annual visit to the property. And we've taken those to court. And, usually once whoever did the violating knows that we're on their case, and then they speak to their attorney, they're pretty much like, dude, you're screwed. You better do what they say they're going to do. And in that case, we've had people go in, compensate the landowner, compensate us for our time and effort for dealing with the problem they caused. And then they had to go in and plant saplings on everything they took, not seedlings, saplings. So, oh yeah. So, we avoid it. We're very good at working problems out just between us and the landowner. It's rare we have a problem with the landowner who did the easement originally. It's usually a successive landowner that has bought the property later that really thought, oh, conservation easement sounds nice, but they didn't really review it.
Okay, thank you.
Usually when property sells, we meet with the new landowner pretty quickly to make sure that they fully understand what the easement's about. Yes, sir.
Yeah, question. I got two questions actually. What about existing gas and oil rights or mineral rights that may already be existing on a property that you have an easement on? Does all the income from that go to you guys? Does it retain with the owner?
If you want to make a deal with us, we could, but no. If there's existing gas line easements or gas and oil wells on the property prior to us doing a conservation easement with the landowner, those trump us. Those easements were of record prior to us getting involved. So whatever the terms of those gas line easements are, that oil well, gas well easement is, or that lease, it supersedes our conservation easement because they were already of record.
And what about non-residential, non-farm type properties? What about like golf courses or something like that?
Golf courses.
There's a number of golf courses I see around here. I'd love to see.
Yes,
conservation easements.
I would too, in some ways, and I'm a pseudo golfer, so I do like to golf. But golf courses can be tricky because there's very specific criteria in the tax code about what is a tax qualified conservation easement. Generally, a golf course does not meet that criteria. There are easements on a couple golf courses. We just did one with Kirtland Country Club not long ago, but they had acreage that was undeveloped as a golf course. They had a bunch of wooded land and some streams on it and some other areas that a conservation easement was an eligible thing for them to do. But to just do it on a working golf course, it wouldn't be a tax deductible piece. Now, we have acquired a number of golf courses. We just got done transferring one to Lorain County Metro Parks last year, 270-acre golf course that went defunct. I'm negotiating on a golf course that is looking to go defunct in Erie County right now. We've bought a couple in Ashtabula County. So golf courses that are ceasing in operation, we've acquired a few of those and turned them into public parks or preserves. But I wish conservation easements were a better tool for golf courses because they're great placeholders in the landscape. Especially the more urbanized you get, you're not going to have 100 acres like that, So it would be great to get them preserved, but from a tax code standpoint, they don't jive.
Next two questions from folks on TV land.
Sure.
Can anyone walk anywhere on a conservation parcel And I think they might be referring to publicly owned conservation.
If it's a public owned piece of property, i.e. a county park district or a municipal park or township park or whatever, then the rules of public access are dictated by whoever owns it. If it's a township or a county park district and they say, well, part of this is public accessible and part of it isn't, that's up to them. They don't have to, it doesn't have to be publicly accessible. For private property, then no, it's not publicly accessible short of whatever the landowner decides what they want to do. I mean, you can still let people come and hunt on it and do whatever. You can have a big party as far as that's concerned, but if you violate the easement, you're going to be in trouble.
The second question is, what happens to a resident on a conservation parcel that the owner wants to leave to his family members? And what happens if and when the family no longer wants to use that residence?
Now, it can still be sold. It can be sold and sold to anybody. So if the patriarch and matriarch of the family pass away and it's going down to the heirs, and nobody that's an heir wants the property or wants to live there, they can sell it to whoever. The easement stays with the property. Just like a gas line easement, just because you move doesn't mean the gas line's up and moving. It's still there. Every successive landowner is going to have to abide by the terms of that conservation easement that the original landowner did.
So if you have a piece of property and there's an easement under it and the heirs want to sell it,
yep.
Does it have to be sold as a total parcel or can it be divided?
Depends on the conservation easement and the terms of that easement. Most of them, the general rule is yes. What you just said is yes. Whatever is covered under the conservation easement goes as one unit.
Okay.
But we have easements where the specific language in our boilerplate template language is what you just said. That if they go to sell it, whatever's covered under that conservation easement has to go as one transaction. It can't be subdivided, parceled out, and sold. But we do hold a few easements where we customize the language so that some subdivision could be done. Limited subdivision could be done in very limited cases.
Thank you.
But that's also why many times when I'm working with a landowner, especially if it's an older couple, they want to put it all under a conservation easement. And I got a couple of their kids around the table and they're like, what about nursing home? What about this? What about that? We were looking at maybe doing, what if I have to cover all these costs and they're going to a nursing home and it's $100,000 a year or whatever it is. And then I'm like, well, then you can look at some other options here. You got a 100-acre farm and you got all this frontage over here and it may not be what's desirable, but you can leave all of that out of the easement. Later, if you don't end up having to use it, you can come to us, we can do an amendment and we'll add it back to the easement, but then you at least have a little bit of an ace in the hole to sell some lots off. It may not be the best for conservation, but when it comes to private land conservation, I'm not turning it into a public park. I'm trying to preserve that land, but yet keep the flexibility that humans are going to live there from now until whenever.
Andy, I have a question.
Yes, sir.
This is regarding if you put on a conservation easement on a piece of private property and the owner then basically still owns that conservation easement and you're planning on donating that easement to a township or whatever, mm-hmm. What about the adjacent neighbors to that easement? Do you have to require a certain written document indicating that they're allowed to go on the easement or things of that nature? So for instance, I have a neighbor mm-hmm. and the easement is going to be adjacent to his property. Mm-hmm. And I'm on good terms with him. Mm-hmm. And I donate the property to a township or whatever, mm-hmm. And I want him to have access to just walk on the easement. Mm-hmm. Is that possible, or is that language done through the township, or how is that taken care of?
Well, the easement, first it comes down to what's written in that specific easement.
Okay, so that's where the language would be.
There. But if it doesn't say anything about public or no public, or giving permission or not giving permission, then it comes down to whoever owns the property as to what permission you're going to give people. So if you have an easement property that has a conservation easement on it,
yes,
and then you donate it to the township,
yes,
can Joe Smith, the neighbor, go walk on that property? That's up to the township to decide.
Okay, so we would have to have a prior agreement to that, allowing certain individuals that maybe are adjacent to these just didn't have access to use it for their, whatever purpose.
In most cases, it's going to become some sort of public park or nature preserve, but I can assure you too that even when we buy land for park districts or they go to buy one themselves, just because they're buying it doesn't mean they're going to open it to the public tomorrow. It's going to take time. I've bought land for parks 15 years ago that's still not open to the public because it's too far removed from the other park, but someday they want to get a park established down there. They don't have the trails built yet. They don't have the parking lot in yet. It's all in their plans to get that ramped up. So In many cases, it takes time. Some cases, it takes hardly any time at all for them to open it to the public. It kind of depends on how ready to go it is.
So adjacent neighbors would have to list them probably in the original.
Well, you can
easement
list
language.
them in there, but for us, our legal stance on that is we're not going to put something into a conservation easement that we feel we can't enforce. So meaning if that's a good example. The other example would be, let's say I've had a landowner that says, I don't want anybody to hunt on this property. I want you to write that into the conservation.
Okay.
I'm going to generally tell them that we're not going to do that because we're not going to have a staff person out there in squirrel season, turkey season, goose season, deer season, and every other season there is to make sure nobody's hunting on your property. So, and that's the same kind of thing there. We're not going to be down there making sure people aren't trespassing.
Okay.
If somebody comes onto the property and violates the easement, whoever owns that property is responsible for those violations, not the trespassers.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, this might be an odd question, but okay, in his case, okay, what if he gives that property to the township?
Yep.
And several years after that, don't forget our tax dollars now are going to be paying the taxes or whatever it is because with the township. Okay, so then what happens in a case like that when if the township says, well, we don't want this property anymore, or it's costing us too much money, or we don't like the logistics of it, and they want to dump that property, could they sell it to anybody they want and pass it on from there, or what?
Actually, Jim would probably be able to answer that better than me, but in terms of a government entity, political subdivision, selling land, it's not an easy task to do.
It's doable, but not an easy task.
It's a lot easier to do it if it's between government entities, like if the township, or let's say a county commissioner's own property, and they wanted to give it to the county park district or vice versa, those are more easily done. But for a political subdivision to just sell it to a private owner, that's challenging to do, and you would know more about that than I. It's tough.
To kind of further clarify though, but that conservation easement, even if the property is sold to an individual, the conservation easement stays with the property. So it doesn't matter if it's owned by the township or an individual, because the conservation easement stays in perpetuity. It cannot be removed from that parcel.
That's a great point. And that's one of the first things when I talk to people who are looking, especially people who are wondering, what am I going to do with this land? I'm thinking of the township. I'm thinking of the park district. Maybe you guys, I don't know what to do. I got heirs, but I don't like any of them and blah, 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 and blah, blah. I'm like, well, a conservation easement is your first line of defense. No matter who owns this property in the future, that easement is going to stay there and our group is going to monitor it forever. So that's kind of your first line of defense. After that, anybody can own it they want, but we're going to monitor it annually, every year. So that's kind of the baseline, what I call the baseline. And even we do have a lot of people that will properties to us. They do an easement first, and then they end up willing the property to us or do a life estate or something like that. And we can't own land in the same name that we hold conservation easements in. There's a legal premise out there called the doctrine of merger. And if we own the land, the fee simple ownership of land, the easement would go away if we took ownership. So we actually have a whole separate 501c3 organization set up to avoid that hurdle. And we do that quite frequently, actually. Somebody wills us the land and the easements in Western Reserve Land Conservancy, well, then the land ownership is going to go under the name of Natural Areas Land Conservancy, which is the other 501c3 that we have. There's always a way around. Any other questions? Anybody from TV land?
Nobody's raising their hand. Okay.
Okie dokie. I'll be here for a few minutes packing up. I got a bunch of business cards in my pocket. If you want one or you have a neighbor that you want to talk to, I mean, I don't make a commission. So when I go to meet with people, I don't give them all the warm and fuzzy stuff. I give them the warm and fuzzy stuff, but then I say, but just remember, here's what's going to result by doing this. I give them the good, bad, and the ugly, the pros and cons, either way. And then I let them weigh that decision out. I always tell people my job is to give you the information to make an informed, educated decision on what you're doing. You know, and if you go forward with it, great. And if you don't, okay.
Recording stopped.
Thank you for coming out.
Thank you. Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. Anytime.
Good to see you. I don't know. Right.